The day the appraiser called me, I was standing in my grandfather's kitchen, still wearing the same gray sweater I'd had on for 3 days straight. There were unwashed mugs on the counter, a half-eaten box of crackers beside the sink, and a stack of condolence cards I hadn't been able to open yet. My grandfather had been gone for 11 days, and I was supposed to be grieving quietly. Instead, I was about to find out that the people I'd trusted most had been lying to me for months. "Miss Delaney Firth?" The voice on the other end was careful, measured, the way someone sounds when they're about to say something they know will change things. "This is Owen McIntosh. I'm the property assessor your brother hired to appraise the Haliburton parcel. I need you to come out here, today if you can." He paused. "Don't mention this call to your brother. Or his wife. Please." I remember staring at the window above the sink, at the frost still clinging to the corners of the glass, even though it was late April. I remember thinking, why would an assessor my brother hired be calling me privately, asking me not to tell my brother? I said I'd be there in 2 hours. "My name is Nora Delaney Firth. I'm 31 years old. I teach elementary school in Barrie, Ontario, and I grew up spending every summer and most of my Christmas breaks at my grandfather's property outside Haliburton. I'm telling you this story because I think you should know that betrayal doesn't always look like a villain. Sometimes it looks like your older brother at a dinner table, smiling at you, passing the bread." My grandfather's name was Edwin Firth. He was 78 years old when he died of a stroke in early April, quietly, in the chair beside his wood stove, where he liked to read in the evenings. The neighbors found him the next morning when he didn't come out to fill the bird feeders like he did every single day. He had fed those birds every morning for 34 years, since the spring after my grandmother passed. The neighbors knew that. They knew something was wrong the moment the feeders stayed empty. My grandfather raised me. Not officially, not in the legal paperwork way, but in the way that actually counts. My parents divorced when I was 4, and my brother Callum was 9. My mother moved to Vancouver for work. My father moved in with a woman in Sudbury and got very busy with his new life. So for most of my childhood it was just my grandfather and me during the summers, school holidays, the long stretches when neither parent quite knew what to do with a small girl who asked too many questions. Callum was older, more independent, better at inserting himself into whichever parent's life was most convenient at any given time. I was quieter. I stayed where it felt safe. My grandfather's property outside Haliburton is 32 acres of mixed forest, meadow, and a narrow stretch of shoreline along a small lake the locals call Beckett's Pond. There's a main cabin, a smaller outbuilding he used as a workshop, and a dock he rebuilt himself when I was 12. I helped him sand the planks. I still remember the smell of the sawdust and the sound of the radio he kept in the workshop, always tuned to CBC. He'd owned that land since 1987. He bought it when he was 44 years old, a few years after he and my grandmother married, using money he'd saved over 20 years working as a millwright. He paid it off by 1993. That land was the thing he was most proud of in the world, and he never let anyone forget it. "That land is yours when I'm gone, Nora," he told me more times than I can count. The last time he said it was Christmas of last year, the two of us sitting at his kitchen table after dinner, both holding mugs of tea. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I didn't understand why he kept saying it. I didn't understand why it needed to be said at all. I do now. The will reading was scheduled for April 22nd, 12 days after my grandfather died, at the office of his lawyer, a woman named Patricia Ogilvy, in downtown Haliburton. Callum drove up from Toronto with his wife, Simone. I drove over from Barrie. We sat in a small boardroom with dark wood paneling and a window overlooking the main street, and Patricia read the document that my grandfather had apparently signed in November of the previous year. According to that document, the entire 32-acre property, the cabin, the workshop, the dock, everything was to be sold, and the proceeds divided equally between Callum and me. I sat very still while Patricia read. I felt Callum shift in the seat beside me, and I saw Simone reach over and briefly touch his hand. A small, private gesture. The kind of gesture that looks like comfort but can also look like congratulation, depending on what you know. I asked Patricia if I could see the document. She slid it across the table. I looked at the signature at the bottom. I had seen my grandfather's signature hundreds of times, on birthday cards, on the bottom of checks he sent me in university, on the Christmas letter he wrote every year and mailed to everyone he knew. The signature on the will was close. It was very close. But the F in Firth curled to the right in a way I'd never seen him write it. And the date beside the signature was November 14th. I knew my grandfather was in the hospital in November. He'd had a minor cardiac event on November 9th and had been discharged on November 17th. I knew this because I had driven out to visit him on November 12th. He had been lying in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm, telling me not to fuss. He had not been signing legal documents on November 14th. He had barely been able to hold a cup of water. I didn't say any of this at the table. I looked at Callum, and he looked back at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral, and I said, "I see." I folded my hands in my lap. I said I needed a few days to process everything. Patricia said that was completely understandable, that there was no rush, that she would be in touch about next steps. On the drive back to Barry, I pulled over twice because my hands were shaking too badly to steer properly. I want to be clear about something. Callum and I were never particularly close, there's a 5-year age gap, and we grew up in different households, but I never thought of him as someone capable of this. He was distant. He was self-involved. He had a habit of forgetting birthdays and showing up empty-handed at family events. But I thought he was basically decent. I thought that was the floor. I thought decency was the one thing I could count on. I was wrong. 2 days after the will reading, I got the call from Owen McIntosh. The drive to Haliburton takes about an hour and 40 minutes from Barry on a clear day. I made it in just over an hour and a half. I pulled into the long gravel driveway of my grandfather's property. I refused, even then, to think of it as anything other than my grandfather's property, and I saw a pickup truck parked beside the workshop and a man I didn't recognize standing on the porch of the cabin, waiting. Owen McIntosh was in his late 50s, stocky, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He was holding a clipboard and a travel mug of coffee, and when I got out of my car, he walked down off the porch and met me at the bottom of the steps. "Thank you for coming," he said. He glanced toward the road, a quick automatic check, and then he said, "I need to show you something inside." The cabin smelled like my grandfather. Wood smoke and coffee and a faint trace of the pine soap he'd used his entire life. I stood in the doorway for a moment, before I could make myself walk in. Owen led me to my grandfather's bedroom, to the old mahogany wardrobe that had stood against the east wall for as long as I could remember. He'd already moved it a few inches from the wall. Behind it, there was a shallow recess in the plaster, maybe 30 centimeters wide and 20 tall, with a piece of trim board fitted across the front. It looked original. It looked like it had been there for decades. He'd found it, he explained, when he was measuring the room for the appraisal. His tape had caught on the edge of the trim board and pulled it partially loose. Behind it was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied with kitchen twine. He handed it to me without unwrapping it. "I think this was meant for you," he said. My name was written on the outside in my grandfather's handwriting, not just Nora. Nora Delaney Firth, in the careful block letters he used when he wanted to make sure something would last. I sat on the edge of my grandfather's bed and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a folded document, a sealed envelope with my name on it, a small USB drive, and a copy of a deed of gift dated March 3rd of the previous year, registered at the Land Registry Office in Haliburton County, transferring ownership of the 32-acre property to me, Nora Delaney Firth, effective upon the death of Edwin Harold Firth, subject to no liens or encumbrances. The deed was real. I could see the registry stamp. I could see the file number. I held it in my hands, and I thought about my grandfather lying in his hospital bed in November, with an IV in his arm, and I thought about the careful curl of the F in that forged signature, and I thought about Simone's hand, briefly touching Callum's arm at the will reading, and something inside me went very quiet and very cold. I opened the envelope. My grandfather's letter was 3 pages, handwritten on the yellow legal pad paper he always used. His handwriting was neat and deliberate. the handwriting of a man who had grown up being taught that how you wrote your letters reflected how you respected the person reading them. He wrote that he had registered the deed of gift in March because he had become worried. He didn't say what had worried him at first. He built up to it slowly, the way he did everything. He wrote that Callum had come to visit him in February, alone, without telling me. That Callum had spent most of the visit asking questions about the property. What it was worth. Whether it was mortgaged. Whether my grandfather had written a will yet. He wrote that Callum had suggested, casually, that it might make more sense to sell the property when my grandfather was gone, since I was a teacher and could use the money, and that neither of us had any real attachment to the land. My grandfather wrote, "He said you had no real attachment to the land, Nora. I thought about the summer you were 8 years old, and you cried for an hour when I told you we had to leave a day early. I thought about every summer after that. I thought about the way you still walk down to the dock first thing every morning when you visit, like you're checking to make sure it's still there. I knew then that your brother had not spoken to you about any of this, and I knew something was wrong. He had gone to Patricia Ogilvy's office the following week and asked her to draw up the deed of gift. He didn't tell anyone. He registered it quietly, kept one copy in a safety deposit box at his bank, and hid the other copy here, in the wall of the room where he slept, behind the wardrobe that had held his clothes for 40 years. He wrote that he had also been keeping notes. That Callum had called several more times after February, always asking questions about the property, always mentioning selling. That in October, Callum had suggested my grandfather update his will, and had recommended a lawyer, not Patricia Ogilvy, a different lawyer, one my grandfather had never heard of. My grandfather had declined. He wrote that he had begun recording his phone calls after that. The USB drive contained 22 audio recordings. I sat on my grandfather's bed for a long time. Owen McIntosh waited in the kitchen. At some point he made tea. He'd found the tin of red rose in the cupboard above the stove, exactly where my grandfather always kept it, and he brought me a mug without being asked. I called Patricia Ogilvy from the cabin. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, very calmly, that I should not move anything, that she would be making some calls, and that I should expect to hear from her within the hour. Within the hour had turned into 3 hours by the time the OPP officers arrived at the property. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, both from the Haliburton detachment. They were professional and careful, and they asked me to walk them through everything slowly. I did. I showed them the recess in the wall. I showed them the deed. I played them 3 of the recordings on my phone so they could hear the audio quality before they took the USB drive into evidence. The 3rd recording was from a call made on October 28th. You could hear my grandfather's voice clearly, careful and deliberate, asking Callum to explain again why he thought Patricia Ogilvy shouldn't be the one to update the will. You could hear Callum's voice saying that the lawyer he was recommending was more efficient, that it would be simpler this way. You could hear my grandfather saying, "Simpler for who, Callum?" And then a pause. And then Callum saying, "For everyone, Dad. For the family." My grandfather was not Callum's father. He was his grandfather. But Callum had always called him Dad. My grandfather had never corrected him. He'd told me once that correcting a person's love was a small and mean thing to do. I thought about that while the officer was writing in her notebook. I thought about how Callum had stood at the funeral and cried, real tears, and how I had stood beside him and not known. Patricia Ogilvy arrived at the property at 6:30. She had been busy. She had already been in contact with the land registry office and confirmed that the deed of gift was valid and properly registered. She had also been in contact with the College of Notaries, because the forged will bore the seal of a notary, and that seal was apparently attached to someone's name and license, and that someone was going to have a very difficult few weeks ahead of them. She sat at my grandfather's kitchen table across from me, and she looked at me with the expression of a person who has been practicing law for 30 years and has developed the ability to be kind without being soft. "The deed of gift supersedes the will entirely," she said. "Regardless of the will's validity, the land was transferred by a registered legal instrument before your grandfather died. The property is yours. This has been true since the day he registered the deed. I asked her when Callum would find out. She said that was going to happen sooner than he might expect. Callum called me the following morning. He had apparently received a call from the OPP. His voice was tight and careful. He said he had heard there had been some activity at the property, and he just wanted to check in, make sure I was okay, and find out what was going on. I let him talk for a while. I had spent a lot of years letting Callum do most of the talking. Then I said, "I found the clock, Callum." I said it because of something in my grandfather's letter. He had written, and I have read this part many times, since I am putting this where only you will find it, Nora, because you are the only one who still stops to look at things. Callum has always been in a hurry. You have never been in a hurry. That is one of the things I love most about you. There was no clock. I made up the clock on the spot, but I said it because I wanted to hear what happened to Callum's voice when he thought I had found something. What happened to his voice was that it stopped. 3 full seconds of silence. Then he said, "What clock?" "Grandpa's," I said. "The one he left for me." Another silence. And then his voice changed entirely. The careful tightness collapsed, and underneath it was something raw and scared, and he said, "Nora, listen, I need to explain." I said, "You should call a lawyer, Callum." And I hung up. He was charged 6 weeks later. Forging a testamentary document is a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. The notary, whose seal appeared on the forged will, a man my brother had apparently met through a mutual contact in Toronto, was also charged. Simone was not charged. The investigators concluded she had known, but had not actively participated in the forgery. She and Callum separated before the case went to trial. I don't know the details of that. I didn't ask. Callum pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in November. He was given a conditional sentence and 3 years of probation. He did not go to prison. A part of me was relieved about that, and a part of me didn't know how to feel about being relieved. Because the person I was relieved for the 9-year-old boy who used to share a back seat with me on long car trips. The teenager who once drove 90 minutes to pick me up when I missed my bus home. That person and the man who had forged my grandfather's will occupied the same body, and I hadn't figured out how to separate them yet. Maybe I never will. Maybe that's not something that gets separated. The property is mine. I went back for the first time alone in early June, a morning with the lake still and the birches just starting to fill out with new leaves. I walked down to the dock first thing, the way I always do when I visit. The boards my grandfather and I sanded when I was 12 have been replaced since then, but the dock is in the same place, at the same angle, looking out over the same stretch of water. I stood there for a long time. I have not decided yet what I will do with the land in the long run. My grandfather's letter said only that it was mine to do with as I saw fit, that he trusted my judgment, and that he was sorry he hadn't been able to see my face when I found what he'd left me. He wrote that he hoped, after everything, that I would find a way back to joy. That the land was always supposed to be a place for that. I think about Owen McIntosh sometimes. About the fact that his tape measure caught on a loose piece of trim, and that he was the kind of person who, instead of just pushing the trim back and going on with his measurements, stopped to look. He could have not called me. He was hired by my brother. Whatever he found in that wall was, strictly speaking, not his concern. But he called, and he waited, and he made tea. I sent him a letter after everything was settled. I don't know if that was a strange thing to do. He wrote back, a short note, and said he was glad things had worked out. He said he had a daughter around my age, and he'd thought about her when he found the package with my name on it. He said he hoped I was doing okay. I am doing okay. I am doing better than okay, on most days, though grief and anger have a way of arriving unannounced and staying past their welcome, and I've had to get comfortable with that. I see a counselor now. Once every 2 weeks. A woman in Barrie, with an office full of plants, who doesn't let me get away with saying I'm fine, and has taught me that the two things, loving someone and being devastated by what they did, do not cancel each other out. You can hold both. It's uncomfortable, but you can hold both. My grandfather was not a dramatic man. He didn't make speeches. He showed up, he paid attention, he kept his promises, and he fed the birds every morning for 34 years because he'd started doing it for my grandmother and then kept doing it because it was the right thing to do. He knew something was wrong, and he acted carefully and quietly and ahead of time because that was who he was. He didn't leave me a message full of anger. He left me a deed and a letter and a stack of evidence, and he trusted me to know what to do with it. I think that is its own kind of love. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just makes sure you're going to be okay, even after it's gone. I still walk down to the dock first thing when I'm there. I stand at the end of it and I look out over the water, and I think about how my grandfather stood in exactly this spot, probably 10,000 times, in every season, in every kind of light. The dock feels solid. The planks don't move. Some things are built to last. You just have to be paying attention to know which ones. If there is anything this story has taught me worth passing on, it's this. Document what matters, and don't wait until you think you need to. My grandfather registered that deed of gift in March, months before his health declined, months before anyone had taken an irreversible step. He didn't wait until he was certain something would happen. He acted when he first felt that something could. Most people wait too long because they don't want to believe what their instincts are already telling them. He believed his instincts. That made all the difference. And to anyone reading this, who is navigating a family dispute over property or inheritance, a registered legal instrument, a deed of gift, a declaration of trust, a codicil witnessed and filed properly, is not the same as a promise at a dinner table or a mention in a conversation. Intent without documentation is almost impossible to prove. Your lawyer exists for exactly this reason. Use them while you still can. And finally, to anyone who has ever had someone fight for them quietly, from a distance, in ways they didn't find out about until much later, I hope you get to tell them thank you, even if only to the open water, even if only in the early morning, before the day has quite started. It still counts. I believe that it still counts.